Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online webinar, Understanding the Impact of EU Legislation on Apparel Supply Chain. I'm Jessie, working with Transformers Foundation. I'll take 1 minute to introduce the context of the webinar and then hand over the microphone to the host. And we will start the content of the webinar in a short moment. So here, just a brief introduction of the context. The seminar was created and hosted by Ingrid Elbertse from Fairwear Foundation and collaborated with Lansing Group, Sapphire Group, Sorcery, Pactics Group, Poetic Gem, Shahi Group, Simple Approach. The webinar is also supported by Transformers Foundation and the GIZ Fabric Asia project. This webinar is part of a series, educational legislative webinars, that focusing on 14 fact sheets of legislation across the EU, US, and UK. The seminar today does not provide any legal advice, but focusing on laying a good groundwork of how to read EU legislation, where to look for information, and in the context of commercial interest, what manufacturers could do to anticipate the impact of the legislation. Now, let me hand over the microphones to Ingrid from Fairwear Foundation.
Yes, thank you very much, Jessie. And of course, thank you, Transformers Foundation, for allowing us to introduce this to you. I apologize in advance. I'm going to do a lot of talking. If there are any questions, please put them in the chat. In the beginning, mainly, I'm hoping for clarification. And afterwards, we have a more extensive session whereby Jessie will read up the questions that you have posed. If we don't get to all of the questions, there will be a Q&A afterwards, and you can send your questions to the email address in the chat as well. So let's get started. The agenda for today, I'll quickly introduce who is Fairwear to you. We will talk about human rights and mandatory human rights and what the difference is. For you to have some basic understanding of the EU legislation process, also for the future, that you yourself can read up on what pertains to you, what affects you and what doesn't. A basic understanding of the EU legislative instruments I hope you will have afterwards, and how to go about assessing the effects of EU laws on you, the suppliers. And we'll go into the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive based on the text, and it has not been adopted yet, I must warn you. It'll be voted on by the European Parliament on probably April 24th. They can, of course, reject it. And even if they adopt it, it might still have to be voted on by the new European Parliament, because there are elections for the European Parliament in June this year. And again, Jessie already mentioned it, a big disclaimer here. We, of course, try to give you an updated version, the most comprehensive and correct information, but no part of it can be considered a legal advice for a specific situation or company, and it's just for your information and educational purposes. Happily answer all your questions, but no legal status. Just briefly, as who is talking to you, who is Fairwear? Fairwear is what they call a multi-stakeholder initiative, meaning that on the board, when it was founded in 1999, are business organizations representing their interests, as well as trade unions and NGOs. So there should be a balance between interests. And below that are the members. Anybody can become a member of Fairwear who meets the criteria. And here's an overview of some of our brands, mainly German. In total, we have 106 that are moving with us to improve supply chains in the textile industry. We used to start with this. So the 8 ILO conventions are represented here. We used to have that as a standard, and we still do, of course, because they're very important. We added legally binding employment relationship, but currently we have switched to the human rights due diligence approach as stated by the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, which is the cycle I'm hoping you're all aware of and familiar with. It starts with a company having a policy on their human rights due diligence management, on the risk management in the whole of their value chain, that they look for and identify, assess, prioritize risks in their supply chain, have preventive or remedial action plans in place, that they track whatever they are doing, whether these measures have the right effect, communicate about this management and the effect it has, and in case that things do go wrong and there are victims, that these have access to some sort of remediation. Special focus for Fair Wear always on the eye level of buyers and suppliers. They must be equal partners in negotiating. And this is also why we co-created the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices that is online, you can find it, with advice and the general principles of what fair purchasing practices look like. And also we are currently developing the assessment framework for it, and we're trying it out in a pilot. All of our brands yearly have to do a brand performance check done by us, very strict, 45 indicators on human rights, 3 layers, basic level, medium level, and higher level. And at the end of this yearly assessment, they are given the label leader, good, needs improvement, or suspended. And you can imagine that needs improvement and suspended are both categories our brands do not want to be in, because that usually means that they end the membership. So what are human rights? I'm not going to go into every human right, but the UN, the United Nations, gives us definition, rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of. So that means you are born with these rights according to the United Nations, and they are inalienable. They cannot be taken away from you. They are rights such as to life and liberty, freedom from slavery, freedom of opinion, the right to work and education, and many more. There are, of course, some famous declarations at a global level. To start with, the United Nations ones in 1948, currently being ratified by 192 countries in the world out of a total of 195. So we can say this is the global declaration. Of course, as a reaction to World War II. Then in 1953, it was followed by the European Convention on Human Rights, 46 European states currently having signed that. And then in 2000, the European Union had its own Charter of Fundamental Rights, as you can see a bit late in the day. And that, of course, pertains to all of EU member states. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, of course, the UN had to consider what do human rights mean when doing business globally. And they developed the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework that starts with the state duty to protect human rights. So the state has an active duty. It has to have laws, strategies, and policies in place to protect the human rights as they are in the Universal Declaration of the UN. Companies, when doing business, have the responsibility to respect human rights, and actually not just the ones that are in the national legislation, because they differ all over the world. They have to respect human rights as in the United Nations Declaration that I mentioned before. And then should things go wrong, victims have to have access to remedy, whatever that may be. That can be state-based or non-state-based, and they, of course, are all connected together. Because these are very high-level principles, it's very difficult to understand as a business what they mean by respecting human rights when trading globally. For that, the OECD, so the Organization on Economic Collaboration and Development, was mandated to develop more practical guidelines and also sector-specific guidelines. And we work as Fair Wear, and I think also Transformers Foundation, mainly with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector, because that is who we are. So it goes into everything and on how to behave in every situation. They also follow the 6 HRDD steps I mentioned before. So the difference between the human rights due diligence and mandatory human rights due diligence: one, it's based on principles, and principles are a proposition. They serve as a foundation for a system. Also, by the way, of course, a law system. Principles as you shall not take human life, things like that. Guidelines are more general rules, pieces of advice on how to apply these principles or go further into the principles themselves. So they are mainly, how do I look at the situation? What kind of decisions can I take? What is available to me? And a law is much different. It can take, of course, the same guidelines and principles as a basis, but they're rules made by a government, some authority that has something to say about a group of people, usually a state. And this tells you how a legal or natural person may or may not behave, and it can also impose sanctions if they do not comply, a very important difference. So principles and rules and guidelines are not the same as laws, although these are usually based on principles and guidelines, obviously. But complying with human rights due diligence principles and guidelines is voluntary, and complying with laws is mandatory if you are within scope. So if you are one of the legal or natural persons addressed by the law, and only then. There are 3 levels currently of mandatory human rights due diligence. There's the UN Binding Treaty on Business and Human Rights. Unfortunately, it has been negotiated since 2014, so it's still not in force nor signed by anybody. At EU level, we are looking at the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That is, again, not adopted yet, but we are fairly sure it will be. And then there's national legislation, which is something you don't actually want, because usually it's like the Modern Slavery Act in the United Kingdom, or it's like the Child Labor Act in the Netherlands. Not enforced yet, but also it takes a piece of human rights. There is the German legislation, the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz in German, that is already in force. But of course, it doesn't create a level playing field at EU level or for supplying companies. When we look at all of these, they in principle do not create new obligations or expectations from the UN guiding principles or the OECD guidelines I mentioned before. Of course, environment has been added, and there is reporting necessary under EU legislation, but in principle, the duty is already there and it's already been used for over 10 years. If there are any questions as to clarity or understanding of what I've said here, please type so in the chat. I will tell you a little bit about the EU legislation process so that you are aware of how things work at EU level, the difference between national level, member state level, and EU level, and also if these processes have anything to do with you. So first, very important, Europe is not the same as the EU. There are over 50 countries in Europe, and 27 of them are currently a member of the European Union. There are certain criteria they need to meet in order to become a member, such as financial ones, for instance. They can't have a big state debt. And the rule of law has to be in place. Just as an FYI, I've also added which countries have the euro. So not the whole of the European Union works with the euro. 20-something countries out of the EU work with the euro, and the rest have their own currency. The EU institutions that are relevant for legislation, there are about 8 or 9 big EU institutions, but not all of them have anything to do with legislation. There is the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers, as it is also called. That is a strategic council. These are the representatives of all 27 member states. So you can imagine the amount of discussion they have. They all have their own political interests, 27 member states trying to have one same idea. Not easy. Then there is the European Parliament that has been democratically elected by the citizens of the EU. So that is the democratic body of the EU. And then we have the European Commission, that is the executive, so sort of the cabinet of the EU that also has the presidency, Ursula von der Leyen, you probably know, and they have different directorates general. So they actually are the daily government, and they also propose legislation. And then there's the European Court of Justice, which is the judicial body. So the lawmakers are 3 of them. It all starts with the European Commission that proposes a law. Then it goes to the European Parliament that can make amendments and then adopt their own position, their own version of the legislation that has been proposed by the European Commission. And the same is for the Council of the EU. So the ministers get together of 27 countries and discuss what do we think is a good legislation. And if these 3 positions are in place, they sit together at the table, not all of them obviously, but their representatives, in what's called a trialogue, and they negotiate a compromise, which is then voted on by the European Parliament and adopted by the Council as well. So this is a lengthy process. There are several types of legislation that they can have. It all starts with strategies. So the European Union, usually the European Commission, sometimes the Council, devises strategies. Where do we want to go? 5-year, 10-year strategies about the internal market and also on the environment. Most of strategies are then supported by laws, to strengthen them, to make sure all member states do the same thing, are working towards the same goal. These laws at EU level, so we're not talking national law yet, are two kinds. They're either regulations or directives. They have nothing else at their disposal. But they can, after a regulation or a directive has been adopted, tell the European Commission, together with member states, to have implementation or delegated acts. So that is refining, detailing more practical rules for the law that has been adopted. To regulations. These usually pertain to the internal market, so they are trade-related laws at EU level. As soon as they have been adopted by the European Parliament, they enter into force in all member states, and there is no room for interpretation by these member states. So basically, a regulation is adopted by the European Parliament. It is translated into all 27 member states' languages and in English, because the UK is no longer a member, but it's still translated into English, and it is put on a website. And as soon as it enters into force, it is actually added to the law in every national member state. So it is national law after that. There's no such thing as EU law in the sense of that you have in the USA, for instance. So it becomes national law, but there is a website of the EU that provides you the text in 27 languages and in English, so you can read what it says literally in every country. Some examples are general product safety and REACH, which is the chemicals legislation. And they can also be complemented by implementation and delegated acts. Then we have directives that are way more common, but also more difficult because they set out general policies and they lay down the results that have to be achieved. But member states are free to decide how to do this. So they can write their own legislation in order to achieve this goal. Directives are suggested proposals by the European Commission and adopted by the European Parliament, and they can have minimum basic rules saying you cannot go below this when you are writing your own legislation to achieve these general policies, or you cannot go further than this, which is called maximum harmonization. After adoption, there is 2 to 3 years for the member states to make it into their own national legislation. So they will be absorbed or integrated into national law, which is very unpleasant and confusing because afterwards you usually cannot recognize in Greek law or French law or Dutch law what the original directive said. And usually they don't refer to the directive. So that is very complicated, unfortunately. I cannot make it any better than that. Some examples of directives at EU level are the Green Claims Directive, the Empowering Consumers, the CSDDD we will be discussing in this session, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that is already in force. And again, they can also provide with implementation and delegated acts for refinement. So regulations, you can almost literally recognize in national law in all EU member states. So there are 27 identical versions of it, and in English as well. And directives, unfortunately, there are 27 different versions of this directive in national legislation of the 27 member states, and they have 2 years to make it into their national law. Very often, by the way, they don't meet these criteria and it takes them longer to do so, which is even worse. A little bit about the EU Court of Justice. It doesn't rule on national cases. So if you have a complaint about, for instance, a company in Germany or a company in France, you do not go to the EU Court of Justice because it doesn't rule on national cases. As I said before, any legislation at EU level becomes national legislation after that. So it is the national courts that will decide. But the EU Court of Justice will decide on cases between member states and other member states, or the European Commission and a member state, and it does interpret legislation. So a national court in Germany, in Holland, in Italy can ask the EU Court of Justice, can you help me understand this law? So what actually pertains to a t-shirt you are producing or to a pair of jeans? What is the textile policy landscape? At a global level, of course, international commitments at EU that the EU has to hold on to will also affect anything you produce, including the sustainability goals at global level, the Paris Agreement on climate. Below that are the EU Green Deal, the EU Circular Economy Plan, and other strategies. There is a specific EU strategy for sustainable textiles that is mainly about circularity and the environment, by the way. And then there are many EU level legislations that have turned into national legislation that are either comprehensive, such as REACH or the Industrial Emission Directive or the Green Claims Directive, or specific for the textile sector, such as the Textile Labeling Regulation. So there is a lot that EU companies have to think about before they can start producing. If there are any questions about the clarity of what I've said so far, please put them in the chat. We will try and get to them after the session. And again, I apologize for talking so long. I hope you can still follow. So how does it affect you? There is a blueprint to EU legislation. So when the European Commission proposes a law and after trialogue it is compromised and it is adopted by the European Parliament, it basically looks the same. It has a title, it states the legal basis for the legislation, it has recitals. These are very important because they explain the legislation that is to follow after that. They give a little bit of the history, a bit of the background. Commonly, they are between 30 and 50 recitals, so there's many pages of explanation, how to read, interpret the legislation that is to follow. Then the legislation starts, the general provisions stating, okay, what are we trying to achieve with this law? What is the goal of this law? Who has to help us achieve it? So is it about products? Is it about services? Is it about companies or consumers or member states? Very important. And also, what are the definitions that we are using when implementing this legislation? Then it goes into what is the duty actually, what are the support measures generally, which is very nice at EU level. There are always support measures, guidelines, financial support, explanations, websites, portals. Then every member state has to say we have a competent authority, so they have to appoint an institution, a government institution that is to have the oversight of the law. That is, they have to monitor it. And also the next part, the next module, the sanctions, they have to sanction in case of non-compliance. So there's always in every member state an organization, a government organization that is responsible for making sure that the law is implemented correctly and complied with. There is also, when is this EU legislation to be reviewed? Every 6 to 7 years. Every law in the EU is reviewed, looked at. Does it have the impact we want? Does it need to be changed? And then there is the when will it enter into force? And when will member states, companies, consumers, citizens have to comply with it? The actual law is only the last part, starting at the general provisions, recognized by, it says Article 1, Article 2 to Article 30 or 40, whatever. So here's a little bit of an example so you know what you're looking at in case you have to do it yourself. Please don't read everything. You do not have to do that unless it really affects you and you want to know. And you can also hire a lawyer, of course. It always starts with stating what it is. To the left is the forced labor regulation that says so. It says it's regulation number something of the European Parliament and of the Council on, and then it says what the subject matter is, prohibiting products made with forced labor. On the right is a directive. It also says this is a directive, so that's very easy to recognize. And that is the one we will go into later, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And it amends some directives and regulations. You can ignore that unless you're a lawyer. And then it goes on to state, okay, having regard to the treaty, so it explains why can we make this law? What is the legal basis? You can ignore that as well. If you're interested in how to interpret the law that is to follow, you can read the whereases. So you see having regard, la, 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 it says whereas. And this is where the recitals start in every regulation and directive, explaining the background and how to read the actual law. Very important. So the general provisions tell you the subject matter and the scope. That is always important. If you read anything of EU legislation, read this. The subject matter can be in one article or in two, as you see on the right for the CSDDD. On the left, forced labor regulation, it says it lays down rules prohibiting economic operators, whatever that may be, from placing and making available on the union market and exporting from the union market products made by forced labor. And you can imagine that if the definitions are to follow, they will explain what an economic operator is and what placing and making available on the union market actually means. On the right, the subject matter has been split from the scope. It says the subject is obligations for companies regarding actual and potential human rights adverse impacts. Also, it lays down rules on liability for violations for these companies that are within scope, and the obligation to adopt and put into effect a transition plan to do with climate change. So there are three main obligations for those within scope, mainly EU companies, from the CSDDD. And the scope is, and there we can see it, I've circled it, the scope is companies in the EU, formed in the EU according to EU law, so in one of the member states that have more than 1,000 employees, and have a global turnover of over 450 million. That is the lowest threshold. It also states the definitions, so on the left for the forced labor and on the right for the CSDDD. I'm not going into that. It states the duty. Article 3.4 is usually where this starts, and there you can find more detailed what actually needs to be done under this law. It also states support measures. I took out in both cases, forced labor to the left, CSDDD on the right, the guidelines that are to be provided for the CSDDD, including sector-specific ones. So that would be good. Then which authority needs to be appointed and the penalties with non-compliance. And then, of course, the most important thing for you starts. If you know whether or not there is going to be a new legislation, because you hear this from Transformer Foundation, you hear it from any other place, maybe Chamber of Commerce. Do you have any legal duties? You look at the general provisions that I just mentioned, the subject matter, the scope, so those that have to make this work, and also if you need the definitions. About the CSDDD, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it is not adopted yet, but we do have the text that will be voted on, and it is either this or nothing. So we are going with this text. Again, I cannot be sure that this is the exact text, but we are working with the idea that it will be. It follows the same blueprint I just mentioned. It has a title, the legal basis, you just saw it in the examples, and it has the recitals explaining the background and giving more detail about the articles that are to follow. Article 1, you just saw it, states the goal, the threefold goal I just mentioned. So the HRDD duty you have, or HREDD duty the EU companies have, the civil liability, and also the climate change plan they need to have. The scope tells who actually has to do this, and then it's followed by the definitions. And again, the goal is for large companies, because it's 1,000+ employees, actual and potential adverse impacts on human rights and the environment. And they have to look for that to their own operations, their subsidiaries, and those carried out by their business partners. That is you, that is suppliers, those are the business partners. And who does it address? So who has actual duties? Is that the business partners under this law? Then we look at the scope. So this is again the general provisions, the scope. For all sectors, whether it's textile or electronics, it says you have to be an EU company, that is criterion 1, who has 1,000 or more employees in the EU, criterion 2, as well as over 450 million turnover worldwide. So 3 criteria. if you do not meet one of the three, you are not an EU company, you do not have more than 1,000 employees, or you do not have a 450 million turnover, then you are not within scope. For you, most likely, you are not an EU company. Maybe you have a branch in the EU, then you must read this carefully. For non-EU countries, only those who have a net turnover of 450 million in the EU itself. So if you're selling, trading directly with the EU and it exceeds the 450 million, you might possibly be within scope. It could also be you are a parent company or you have a franchise in the EU or a licensing agreement, then you might also be within scope. If none of the above is the case, so you are not in the EU or you're outside of the EU, but you are trading yourself in worth of 450 million every year, if not, you have no legal duties under this directive. None. You are not touched by this in any way legally. And also, very important, you cannot be sanctioned or fined. Only the ones within scope can be. And it's only if you have a link to the EU. Then the question may become, okay, do I maybe have clients, buyers that are within scope? First, it is a directive, so there is time for member states to start transposing this legislation and making it national legislation. That does not start until 2026. So there are at least 2 years to prepare before the first laws are to be transposed. And then no companies have to be compliant in 2026. It is a phased approach in this directive that was negotiated by the member states. It starts with really large companies with over 5,000 employees in the EU and over more than $1 billion worldwide net turnover. They have to start being compliant in 2027, starting 2027. Then the next phase of companies is in 2028, slightly smaller, still very, very large. They have 4 years to prepare, 2028. Third country, so that could be you, if you have over 900 million in the EU, then you have to start thinking about being affected directly, having legal duties under this legislation. And then the last phase comes into have to be compliant, which is the 1,000 or more employees, as well as 450 million worldwide net turnover. So if you are within the EU, you have to look at this. Do I have 1,000 employees in the EU, as well as more than 450 million worldwide net turnover? Third country, so you're not a company formed according to EU law. You are, I don't know, wherever you are, Bangladesh, Cambodia, but you are trading in worth of 450 million or over. You might be in scope in 2029. So there are many, many years to prepare. If your client is within scope, you do not have to provide any kind of information and you do not have to collaborate in any way. You have no duties to do so. But of course, as Jesse said at the beginning, you will have commercial considerations to do so anyway. You will want to have this client maybe, and you will want to negotiate under what conditions you will want to work with these people. Very important. The general effects, as with any new legislation, and particularly this one, it's a prescriptive one, it's about behavior. So companies, particularly those that have not been doing anything, they will start to panic. And they will, of course, until this framework is fully mature, fully fleshed out, in the different member states, there may be different interpretations. There will be a lot of help available, but there will be some confusion about what exactly it is that the national law is going to say. And of course, brands are likely to set different requirements. We have seen that in the German Supply Chain Act already. We have now about 14 months experience. There are actually brands that are making big mistakes. Fortunately, of course, we have the competent authority that will sanction them for doing so, for trying to put all of the responsibility on their suppliers, because that is illegal from now on for them. On the other hand, looking at these general effects, there are the measures that are already in the CSDDD. The UNGP and the OECD guidelines are followed, and many of the companies that are already beginning to do their HREDD, their human rights due diligence, their environmental due diligence, are looking at these guidelines. So they should be more or less in line with these guidelines. The European Commission will provide extra guidelines based on the CSDDD for all the member states within 30 months after adoption. So that means before anybody has to be compliant, at least 6 months before, there will be sector-specific guidelines on how to implement to comply with this legislation. They can also take new measures, not just the guidelines, including for third countries. And that is probably also the GIZ fabric, for instance. There will be money available to support suppliers. There will be a single help desk for member states explaining to them how to implement this law. So you can assume that this will be more or less aligned. The Commission will provide model contractual clauses after consulting with stakeholders. Stakeholders meaning you as well. They will reach out to you and ask for your advice. What are proper contractual clauses that allow you to do your work in a normal way? Very important. There will be websites and portals for your information as well, and for stakeholders, including you. And there will be specific support for SMEs in the change of activities. So if you are an SME, then you will be supported specifically. I have taken out some of the recitals that are very important, I think, and of influence on your work. That the companies, meaning the companies within scope, the EU companies, they should also be responsible. Should means they have to, they are responsible to use their influence to contribute to an adequate standard of living in their chains of activities, meaning including a living wage. That means their prices have to be set in a way that allows their suppliers, you, to pay proper wages. Living wages in future, I don't think that's a reality yet, but at least they have to cost for human rights, they have to cost for fair wages. Companies will have guidance as to what corporate behavior is prohibited in accordance with internationally recognized human rights. So they will have sort of a list by the European Commission. This is what you cannot, must not do. They have to engage before they up and leave. Of course, in the time leading up to the CSDDD becoming implemented, before they have to be compliant with that, there will be some irresponsible companies that will leave certain countries or leave certain suppliers. That is not what they're allowed to do, but of course, there's always companies that will do so. But in principle, they have to engage before they disengage. And if they do end a business relationship, this has to be a last resort and the exit has to be responsible. So considering the effects of them leaving, and they must engage with stakeholders, including workers and suppliers, about the effects of this. This is the duty they will have under the law. So anybody within scope, probably not you, has to go through the 6 HRDD steps. I will not go into that any further here. Interesting for you, though, is that they will have to have policies and risk management systems in place, describe them, including long-term policies they have, and they have to be published. That means that anybody, including you, has access to them. You can read your clients, your buyers' policies online if they are within scope. They have to have a code of conduct describing their rules and principles, which will be verified by the competent authority in every member state. Have you written down the proper policies? Are they okay? Are they responsible? And they may include companies' direct or indirect business partners, meaning you. But the measures taken to verify compliance with the code of conduct and to extend this application to your business partners, they have to be fair. So it's very important. They will have their own code of conduct online. They will share it with you, and it will have to be fair. That is very important. Article 5 says policies and risk management systems. They, again, have to verify compliance, but the effect may be, of course, lots of codes of conduct. We understand that. But the common trend is adopting the rules of the OECD. And if you are familiar with them, you can have your own code of conduct and say, listen, I don't need yours. I have my own. Look, here it is. It is OECD aligned. And let's discuss together what this might be. They can seek it, but they cannot force it upon you. And it will be scrutinized. And because they have to have this policy published, that means any NGO, any trade union will be able to read it and will be, of course, supporting any feedback on that. Information that they need and for their assessment, it is also in their in the actual articles of the law says, please do not ask everyone in your supply chain for information randomly. Ask very targeted information from there where the most risks are. So first you do your risk scoping and risk assessment, and then you ask for more information. Don't just randomly send out surveys. That is basically what this article says. So that's a very strong article that you may rely on. I'm going to go through Article 7 about preventing potential adverse risk impacts. That is in the duty of the companies within scope. And Article 8 about the actual adverse impacts follows more or less the same line. And we don't have to know everything. You don't have to know everything about this. Apologies for that. But the most important things I have in here. So in order to prevent any adverse impacts that are, I don't know, building safety, deadlines that are way too short, they must set up a prevention action plan. They must do this. And you must know about this, of course. And they must share this with you. And they must seek contractual assurances of you, of their direct and indirect business partners, but they must seek it. They cannot force you to sign anything. And very important, they must be designed in a way that responsibilities are shared appropriately between you and the business within scope. They may take other capacity building guidance measures. They can support you financially or administratively. They are allowed to support you in any other way that helps you. I'm very sorry about this. If they ask these compliance measures, codes of conduct from an SME, they shall bear the cost of any verification, so the cost of audits. They must bear that under this law. So if they are within scope, they must pay for any audits or on-site assessment, whichever they are. And if this SME says, but you know what, I will pay part of the cost, then you are allowed to share with any of your other buyers the outcome of this audit. That is to protect you. I'm sorry about this. No. So, dear, dear. I think my PowerPoint is slightly going crazy. We're almost there, so bear with us, please. So what can you do? There are 3 to 5 years to prepare for this. This webinar is just the first step. There are more to follow. When we know more, we will share with you. But you must get started now. Start looking at information collecting. Start your own human rights due diligence. Look at your supply chains. Look at where the risks are so that you are well prepared. Start talking to your customers, start talking to your buyers. Are they within scope? Are they a member of anything that might be important, such as Fairware? Do they work with Transformers Foundation? Are they a part of any other Amphori ETI? That is very important to know. Then you know that they have support for doing this properly. There are many tools available as well, such as the Fairware Fair Price app. And again, we will be there to support you, and so will the EU. There is a lot of help being set up already. Germany, together with several other EU companies, is starting to create an EU help desk. It has 4 access points, one of them specifically for suppliers. So you will be invited to engage and to provide information. You can influence the implementation of the CSDDD by participating in roundtables, in events where this help desk is seeking your information. You can tell them what bad codes of conduct are, what bad contractual clauses are. The European Commission will develop guidelines. Germany has set up already responsible business hubs. You can get in touch with them and ask them to support you and provide them with feedback for the upcoming legislation. And again, the measures by the Commission are also meant to support third country companies, including SMEs. Many organizations, Transformer Foundation, Fairware, IAF, STTI, ETI, Amfori, are all working together, including SLCP, Worldly, to support this process. We want this to be successful, and we want you to be successful and to actually be able to have a positive change. So we will definitely continue our webinars and continue our support, and also including in production countries. Many of my Fairware colleagues are in producing countries and are to be contacted by you and others. So I apologize for my PowerPoint being so difficult this morning. And I think this basically concludes our webinar. If you have any questions, I hope you've put them in the chat. Jessie, I will put this on there as well. And stop my share. Are there any questions in the chat?
Hi,
and again,
Ingrid.
I apologize for the huge amount of information. Please be aware that afterwards you can also send any questions to the email address that you find in the chat, or maybe to me, but preferably to one central point, and we will definitely talk about them more.
Hi, Ingrid. Thank you very much for the very
Yes, I'm not sure I can hear you.
I come back. It's
Okay, there you are.
More small block of the internet.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Ingrid, thank you very much for sharing this very comprehensive and solid knowledge.
Sorry about that.
No, it's very clear. It's really clear, and I like it. So I have two questions. One, maybe three now. So first one is traceability and due diligence. Sorry for my video. I think there is a internet problem. So anyway, the first question is about traceability and due diligence. There is a lot of stress on traceability, tracking how the material has traveled through different supply chain nodes. Traceability gives origin information, but doesn't serve due diligence element. How can both elements work together? And organizations working on providing traceability software are tech-wise and advanced, and organizations doing due diligence are again different. So how will an organization know which one they should opt?
Yes, very correct question, and I completely understand. One, in the textile sector, there have been a lot of initiatives already, because we all know that the textile sector is a high-risk sector, and that means in the last years, Fairware has been there for 25 years. Many other associations have existed for a long time as well. There are many startups, particularly on the technical side of things, that have all their own ideas, you know, apps to survey, apps to trace, there is blockchain, there is a lot of developments that are, for now, are popping up like mushrooms, right? They're everywhere and you don't know what to choose. One of the things that is going to happen is that the European Commission is going to have an overview. In Germany, the GIZ you mentioned before is already doing this. It's already plotting the landscape, mapping the landscape for, amongst others, the textile industry to see what is there, what is good enough, and what can support. That is one step. So authorities, if you will, in several member states are already starting to work on collecting everything that is there and connecting it. And I also said at the end of my, probably the pop-up screen was there at a couple of times, we, Fairware, we Transforma Foundation, IAF, ETI, Amfori, SLCP, and all of the app developers, we are working together. We are trying to make sure that you have one comprehensive information website, tool, fact sheet with where to go and what to use. It is all in development now. That I understand that is a problem, but we are definitely working towards easier assessment to what is good for me in my situation. But for now, you would just have to bear with us. But again, engage, be active, give feedback, and say this is something that doesn't work for me or doesn't work in the textile industry, and share with colleagues, with other companies. I think that is very important, or through other platforms such as Fairware or Transformer. But for now, it's a bit of a struggle. I agree.
Yeah. Yes. And Ingrid, I think maybe we can quickly summarize for this question that
Okay.
several organizations, as you mentioned just now, Fairware Foundation, Fairware Foundation, Transformers Foundation, and the GIZ Asia Fabric, and many other organizations like IAF working on a list of information to help manufacturers to clearly assess what is good for me, which tool is good for me in my situation. So for this question that how requirement of traceability and requirement of due diligence could work together for the manufacturers, and how manufacturers can know which one they should opt, that for now we don't have a clear tool for that, but in a close future there would be some information. And also, just to let everyone know, Transformers Foundation will send the recording of this webinar to all the registrations, and probably with some help desk links to everyone.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and now I have second question about scope. It's always a hot word.
Yeah, that's
so. What does it depend on? Yes, scope is a difficult one. So the question is, what does it depend on whether subsidiaries within the EU are in scope if the parent company is not in EU?
Well, that is in the end, right? It's a phased approach. But if the subsidiary within the EU meets the criteria, so that means they have 1,000 or more employees, they are formed according to EU law, and they have this 450 million global turnover in the last 2 years before the CSDDD is in force, then they are within scope. And that means that the parent company, of course, is connected to the subsidiary within scope. Usually the subsidiaries are meant the other way. So let's say a big EU company, let's say H&M, is within scope, and so are then all its subsidiaries. We have, for instance, a very small company at Fairware, but because they are part of a group, they are within scope anyway, because the group together, the parent company, including the groups, is within scope if you count every employee in every of the little companies. So from the outside in, it's a little bit more complicated. You have to look at, okay, what goes for third countries, and that is just the turnover. Unless you have a subsidiary in EU, and then it goes to EU company scope. So if there's a subsidiary in the EU, you pretend, okay, that is an EU company. Does it meet the criteria? And it has to meet all of the criteria, not just one. So again, look at the general provisions.
Thank you, Ingrid. And we have a few minutes left. If we could quickly have some highlight for the attendees today. You have a blueprint of EU laws. So for you, like general provisions, duties, and supportive measures, and so on and so on. So for you, if we can only pick up one, which one is the most important thing that manufacturers need to look at first if they want to understand the law correctly? Oh, Ingrid, I'm not sure We still have you. I think there is an internet connection problem. So just let everyone know, we input the email address in the chat box, communications@transformersfoundation.org. That is for further communication. If you have any questions, please reach out to that email address, communications@transformersfoundation.org. And we will collect all your questions and very likely reply it in either an email or either collect them for the next webinar. So I think we have a few minutes left. We covered a lot today on how to read and understand the law. And as Ingrid mentioned, this is just step one on understanding the impact of legislation on the fashion supply chain. So just to let everyone know, as the next step, Transformers Foundation is working with the Remedy Project on a deep dive into CSDDD, German Supply Chain Act, CSRD. It will be released on May 14. So please follow us, follow Transformers Foundation, GIZ, Fabric Asia Project on LinkedIn to have the news. Stay tuned and see you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for everyone. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessie, and thanks, Transformers.